I have a couple questions that I'm going to sort of prime the pump with here, Lynn.
Okay.
And then, we can just let the conversation flow however it does. There are many things about your history and what you've done in your career that are immensely impressive and have broken all kinds of barriers. But one of the things that I've been most intrigued by, and which I know very few other people who have achieved, is the way in which you have not only tolerated and encouraged a multiple methods approach to how one does work, but how you've conquered so many different methods. You really are very au courant in just almost, first you learned game theory and you learned microeconomics, you've been president of the Public Choice Society. How did you do that? What gave you the capacity to do that, and what gave you the reason to do that?
Well, partly as an undergraduate, I had to work my way through, and UCLA, and I took a double major. Political science didn't look like it was as much of a potential place to get a job, and with economics, I took some business. I thought maybe that would enable me to get a job eventually. And it did.
You were right.
Yeah. Yes. And I spent then 3 years in Boston, and my first experience of graduating from college and going out in the world was, do you have typing and shorthand?
Right.
And I didn't have shorthand, so I had to learn it via, that was one of the first skills I had to learn after my baccalaureate. And actually, I still use it because if you're doing an in-depth interview,
right,
and you can take the first 6 words or 8 words, you don't have to take the whole thing, and it's fast. And
no one has to transcribe it the same way they do with it.
Yeah, and so they're not teaching it the way they used to, but I fortunately did have to take it, and I actually didn't ever use it for a real job. I've just used it as one of my skills. But then going back, I was in business in personnel management. I went back home and became a public personnel manager at UCLA and started coursework for a master's. And thought, this is kind of neat. A lot different than undergraduate, because when I was an undergraduate, my goal was graduating and I was working 30 hours a week. And you learn how to take exams. And so I consider my baccalaureate to have taught me how to take exams. Then I got into these graduate seminars and, they're really interesting and fun. So I thought, well, why not go to graduate school? And I went over and talked to the folks in economics, and they said, don't think it makes very good sense. They didn't want to have me apply even.
I think they're kicking themselves right now.
Well, political science would admit me. But then I think in the prefatory I mentioned that they had not had a woman in the department for simply years, and they admitted 4 of us in a class of 40, and it was a huge controversy. That we found out. Fortunately, there were 4 of us because we could kind of buddy together.
Right.
And so I took a lot of economics in my graduate program, but I was studying water resources there, so I had to take some water resources. I took Oscar Grusky and sociology, and so I learned a good deal about the sociology of things at that point. So my PhD committee had engineer, sociology, economics, and political science on it.
So you've always been interdisciplinary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just kind of thought that was the way you did things.
And did the economics give you a base for learning these other skills that you learned? The game theory, obviously.
Oh, yes. Well, yes and no.
But the behavioral economics, the experiments, is sort of a whole nother set of skills.
Yeah,
right?
but that grows out of having a very firm, solid interest in economics, which I've had all the way along. And then learning game theory, I didn't learn it as a graduate student, but I learned it later and had the great pleasure of working with Reinhard Zelton.
Right.
So I learned it from a
master.
pretty great master. but the my
So you learned that year in
Bielefeld.
Bielefeld?
I had started to have some reading in game theory before I went there. Then that year, I sat in on a seminar that was not a course, it was just visiting lectures. Then he invited Vincent and I back. Vincent had to edit a book, and I was back for a whole semester, and I took his game theory in German.
Wow.
And that helped both my knowledge of game theory and my knowledge of German. So I learned he is a master and is not trying to show off. He's trying to really get you to have an understanding of what is the foundation and what are the reasons and why do you come to this conclusion versus that. And then I worked with Franjo Weissing the second time I went back to Bielefeld. He is a mathematician also and a biologist, and
interesting.
so I was able to do a couple of game theory articles with him. So I really have treasured game theory as a way of getting into the hub of some things. Now sometimes what it helps you is it shows something in game theory being unlikely or irrational.
Right.
And then you can take that and put it in an experimental lab. And I was very, very fortunate that Jimmy Walker came to Bloomington just as I was getting hungry for how would we ever put these things in a carefully developed laboratory experiment. And he is a fanatic for getting everything well-designed, pre-tested.
Absolutely.
Oh, I mean, when you do a lab experiment with an expert like Jimmy, you know you've taken the theory and put it in the lab, as Vernon Smith urges you to do. Jimmy did a postdoc with Vernon Smith, so there's a connection there. And it's enabled us to take things that I observed in the field, then we could look at it through game theory, then we could go to the lab and test, was this just an unusual set of things that I saw in the field? Or under careful, would you find it repeated under situations that were very carefully designed? Wonderful to be able to go back and forth.
Well, it sounds like you're both a lifelong learner and a learner by doing.
Well, yes, because I now have published several things using remote sensing.
Right.
Now I have always done that with a co-author. I know enough about remote sensing that I can do some of the field work that's necessary to do.
Now, could you explain what remote sensing is a little bit for?
Okay. It's using GIS or Geographic Information Systems to record some of the data from the satellites that go over. And what I learned from taking a seminar with Tom Evans here on this campus is that satellite sends back images, but they're in long strings of digital numbers. So something has to interpret it, and over time they've developed very general programs for interpreting it. But if the light coming from the sun is coming on a hillside, it reflects differently to the satellite than when it comes to flat. And when it comes and there's corn, it's sometimes hard to tell whether that's corn or young forest. And so if you're really going to do a good job of interpreting, you have to take a geographic position system, GPS machine out into the field, and at key junctures, take measurements and record where you were exactly and what you saw. Then that gets back into the computer and tightens up the analysis. And you do, say you take 100 sites out in the field, you put 50 in, and then see what happens. Can you predict? You take 25 of your other sites, can you now predict them? And if you can predict them at 90% accuracy, you don't need to do anything more. If you can't, you take some of those other 25 and put them in to the point you can predict at 90% accuracy.
So what you've been doing is finding, you started in many ways, I mean your original research when I first met you many years ago was doing field work. I mean, you were literally out there
Oh,
counting
yes.
things and talking to people, and you've developed all these other skills that improve that analysis, and you seem to keep going back between the field and a high level of abstraction, but informed by both theory and a very sophisticated, whatever the cutting edge methods are as we develop them.
And now I try to teach my graduate students that they should learn one method really well, at just far out expert. They should have a second one that they learn very well, not necessarily right at that extreme level, and then be aware of the skills from some of the others so that they can work with teams.
Right.
So with the remote sensing, I don't do all the analysis. I've worked with Harini Nagendra and other colleagues who are experts, but I know enough that I can work with them.
Well, you're also bringing some questions that they might not otherwise ask.
Yeah. But on some, or right now I'm doing a lot of work in forestry. And that means we go and we define the boundaries of a forest. We draw a random sample of plots. Random sampling is something I'm familiar with.
Yeah.
But then inside we draw circles of 1 meter, 3 and 10. And we have to count every tree. Well, I can count trees.
Right.
And I've now learned how. Do you know what a DBH is?
I haven't a clue.
Diameter breast height. And it is a very key measure, so that if you measure a tree about here, and there's a real place for it, but it's basically under your chin about, and then you measure the height, you can get a volume. And that's one of our ways of getting a basal area and getting a sense of the volume of wood and carbon in a forest.
So how does this relate back to your institutional analysis? What are you doing with the remote sensing data, for example, that is informed by the kind of institutional analysis that you've made famous?
Well, there what you have to do is get a foundation of the slope and all aspect, et cetera, the ecology. But then you can't do it unless you can get clear boundaries of what's on the ground. And that takes a lot of field work to get the boundaries and to know the rules of that. Then you can look at 3 time periods and the space, and look at what difference does having the boundary here. In some cases, the boundary makes no difference.
Right.
Everything going around on every side of it is the same. In other cases, the boundary cuts off.
Makes all the difference.
Makes all the difference. But you've got to have the institutional knowledge to get the boundaries right. If you can't do that, you can't use it for institutional analysis.
Right. So this very much fits with the work you've been doing about the conditions all your life, really, about the conditions under which different kinds of institutional arrangements work and other kinds work, and which kinds of governance systems will promote one goal as opposed to another goal.
Yeah, and it's fun.
Yeah, sounds like fun.
Well, one of the ones that is in the supplement for the article in Science that Tom Dietz and Paul Stern and I did on the struggle to govern the commons, I love the title, is of 4 protected areas in Guatemala, one of which is Tikal. And this is a simply beautiful area. People flock to it from
gorgeous.
all over the world, and they pay a good fee. And they pay so much that the protected area sends money up to the government. Thus, they can put walls around, they can march around, and it's in excellent shape. In the same remote picture, not picture, but same remote image, there are 2 other protected areas, same institution, devastated by deforestation. And then there's a 4th one that is in good shape, but nature's protecting it. It takes 3 days by mule to get up there.
Interesting. Interesting. So the other theme I'm hearing here, which brings me back in some ways to the workshop, is collaboration.
Oh, yes.
And interdisciplinarity. And I know that lots of people this week have been talking to you about the obstacles that you faced as being a woman, but I'm also interested in the obstacles you've faced as being someone who's seriously committed to interdisciplinary work and to collaborative work. We tend to think of scholarship, unfortunately, I think, I share this taste with you, as being sort of monastic. Everybody goes into their office or goes off in the field, but you really are committed to interdisciplinarity and teamwork, and the workshop is the model of that. So what kind of obstacles have you faced in sort of creating that kind of institution?
It's been a challenge. Disciplines don't like it when you publish in other places. And for example, I was very thrilled when Jimmy Walker, Roy Gardner, and I had an article in the American Political Science Review in 1992. And that was the Covenants with or Without Swords. And
Right,
it turns out
right.
to be a very key publication in terms of looking at the role of people monitoring each other. But Jimmy and Roy were told by their department that it would give them no credit at all.
Right.
American Political Science Review. And I think some of my articles in economics have not been given much credit by my department. So I do advise my graduate students, until you have tenure, please be sure that there are 2 or 3 articles and you're the only author and it's in your discipline. I hate to advise you this way, but I want to see you have tenure. And I know in many departments, one, they don't know what to do with co-authored. So anytime you have a tenure thing, you have to write all your co-authors and ask them to say whether or not you did
Right.
anything. And if there are none, I was on the college tenure committee, people coming up for tenure who had only co-authored were frequently rejected because they did only teamwork.
Right.
And so part of our rules inside the university are not enhancing interdisciplinarity and teamwork.
So what kind of, I know it's still a very tough road for non-tenured faculty. Do you think it's gotten easier?
A little. And there are now schools that are interdisciplinary and are a lot easier to
Yes, there's more of that.
Yeah, there's
Absolutely.
much more. But it's
within
if
the
you go in, if
disciplines-
you're traditional economics or traditional political science, it's rough.
I don't know, I've been noticing that in some of the best political science departments, the highest ranked ones, it's become a lot easier to do that. There's a recognition that cognitive science is a
Yes.
crucial
Yeah.
tool, that economics is a crucial tool, and that you therefore might publish in
Yeah.
their journals if
Yeah.
you're really good at that work.
Yeah, otherwise you're making claims that isn't supported.
But is that and that
I think you're right.
Yeah.
But it's, we're,
It's still a tiny
Yeah.
fraction of
yeah,
it.
it's still, we need more of it.
Absolutely. Well, what about once you got tenure? Did you still face all kinds of obstacles? You've mentioned the problem that Jimmy and Roy faced.
Partly, we created the workshop, and so our life and activities were a weekly colloquium, our own graduate students, getting them out, bringing in NSF money. So I did do a great deal of writing grants, and NSF has been wonderful. Thank you very much.
And you've helped NSF this week. I hear Barbara Mikulski was noting you, as Senator Mikulski was noting you,
Oh, good.
to help make sure that the political science program in NSF was continued to be funded.
Yes.
So thank you, Lynn.
Yeah, well, thank you, NSF, because you can't do the kind of, if you're going to do large N, and one of my studies had a survey of 18,000.
Right.
Well, you can't do a random sample of 18,000 people without external. Then we did another study that was of 80 metropolitan areas in the U.S. We're now doing a study of over 200 forests around the world. None of that is feasible without financial support.
Right. So, but by getting these grants and having the workshop, you were able to insulate yourself, I take it, to some extent from some of these counter pressures towards doing interdisciplinary
See,
work.
I was not ever concerned about salary, so that's never been an issue for me. And for some colleagues who have big families and all the rest. It's a major issue, and so.
Well, they also tie up their prestige with their
Yeah,
salaries.
and I don't.
Yeah.
I don't. In fact, when I was chair of the Department of Political Science, I purposely kept my salary at zero because our junior faculty were we weren't competitive, and I was very, very worried. So for me, that sort of thing, I don't compete with my colleagues. It's just not something that's not the way I think. And so it really hasn't been an impediment, but so we've had excellent political scientists involved in the workshop for a very long time. And some of them were so excellent that other places have hired them.
Yes, I know. So in the prefatory, you talk about the problems of getting a job in the first place and even the problems of getting tenure. What about the problems? Were there any problems you faced going from associate to professor to full?
No, I don't think so. I never even, I'm not sure how many years I just didn't pay any, I had tenure, so I wasn't paying attention to these things.
And it just happened when it happened.
Yeah.
Right.
No, after being so turned aside at an early juncture, where it was, you'll never be able to teach in a major university, you just can't get a job, I think getting tenure and being able to have the workshop and the activities, et cetera, that was so satisfying that I didn't worry about some of these other ranking things.
Right. One of the questions that you talk a little bit about this in the prefatory, but I've always been deeply curious about, and you saw the video we did last year with Robert Dahl and the history of how he got into the concept and the way he thought about democracy. I mean, the thing that you've really focused on is the commons and the way in which, and common pool resources and how people manage those. And how did this issue come to be so critical to you?
Well, I heard Garrett Hardin give a lecture, and I didn't know when I did my dissertation on groundwater basin management and watching 700 people go through a very tough job of negotiating in the shadow of the court and creating special districts and doing incredible things, that they were dealing with the commons. My dissertation used the concept of public entrepreneurship. So I was very much influenced by Buchanan and Tulloch and Schumpeter. So Schumpeter's notion of entrepreneurship was what I was looking at when he was public entrepreneurship.
Well, why water resources then? What got you?
A seminar, the first seminar I took with Vincent, and then we didn't continue being student faculty because we dated and all. He had a brilliant idea. He had been studying water resources in Southern California, and he was seeing that the various groundwater basins were organized differently. And so he made it apparent to anyone who might be in a graduate seminar that they would have to take one of these basins and really dig in and figure out what was going on. Well, I was assigned West Basin. I don't even remember why. We just there was a list and you got assigned it. And it turned out that West Basin was 45 minutes away from UCLA and the headquarters. And I went down and I started to attend the meetings of the private association that they had created to discuss this. And I could see them struggling with these ideas and what to do and how to do it. And then I interviewed them in depth. And then the wonderful thing when you study local, sometimes you have access to files that you don't have if you study Congress. And so I was talking with them and I said, well, how would I find some of the early paperwork? Oh, here's the filing cabinet. Yeah, it's right there. You can open any file drawer. You can take anything we have a copy of. So if there was a copy, I could literally have one of the copies. And if there wasn't one and I wanted it, they said, just here's Xerox, make it. Of course, it was in the days before you had computers. That gave me insights to people, some of whom had spent 20, 30 years trying to solve this tough problem. And there had not been one thing they did. They did a number of different things, including building a barrier against the ocean coming in by putting water down through wells. Very ingenious. And so when I didn't know I was studying the commons. Well, then in '68, I defended '65. Mansell Olson's book was written and published in '65, and so it wasn't something I read at the time of doing the dissertation. Buchanan and Tulloch was '62, so I had. But Hardin gave a speech on the IU campus, and I went to it, and he indicated the more general, but then it was that he really was worried about population. And he indicated that every man and every woman should be sterilized after they have one child. And he was very serious about it.
This was Garrett Hardin.
Yes, not Russell.
Right.
Yes, Garrett Hardin. And I was somewhat taken aback. My theory proves that we should do this. And well, people said, well, don't you think that that's a little severe? No, that's what we should do, or we're sunk. Well, he, in my mind, became a totalitarian.
Yeah.
And I thus had seen a real instance where his theory didn't work, and his theory he was carrying forth at such a level. And we were then doing the studies of police, and we did that for 15 years all over the country. But and that would have been studying local public goods.
Right.
A different kind of commons, but
Right.
nonetheless.
But these were the issues that were gripping you, how people solved these problems.
And then there was a National Research Council committee created, and what they had found was that political science were talking to economists or sociologists or engineers or historians. People who studied Africa didn't talk with people who studied Asia. And if you did fishery, you didn't know anything going on about water. So we had 3 ways of cutting into the study of common pool resources, and no accumulation.
Wow.
None. And we then had a big meeting in Annapolis in 1986 and began to discover it. And within 6 months, we had identified over 1,000 case studies written all over the world. And that was just amazing. And so all of us who lived through that experience were changed. And that was when I first turned to meta-analysis of how did we identify and see if we couldn't code them. And there, it was agonizing, because you'd identify 10 variables.
Right.
And then case A had 5 of them and not the other 5. And case B had
The other 5.
other 5, but not. And so we had to go through an incredible number of individual cases before we could get a set that had common variables. And so you knew your theory.
And this was what years?
Oh, this would have been, the big meeting was '86, and so we were struggling in the late '80s to create the database. And what was wonderful about it was our field was a filing cabinet that we could all go to. So we would be arguing about this, and well, now let's go back and recode your cases with this idea. Check on new cases about this. And so
So it wasn't all digitized.
No. Oh, no.
Yeah, just to remind
no.
our viewers of how
But it
recent
gave us,
computers are.
It turned out meta-analysis there was unbelievably useful, because the field was right there. And we met every week, and we would work on something, and then we'd say, we don't have this quite right. Let's go back, reread some of what we've done, and take another case or 2 so that we'd push it ahead. And you can't do that out in the field.
So some of this work informs governing the commons, obviously.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And I worked on that, and Adela Schlager and S.Y. Tang did their dissertations on this, and eventually part of that became the book Rules, Games, and Common Pool Resources with Jimmy and Roy Gardner. But when I was in Bielefeld the second time, everyone pushed me for, let's get some, what kind of market rules will work?
Right.
What kind of bureaucratic rule? I mean, they wanted simplest, and I kept reading, and we couldn't come up with simple answers.
Right.
And so I had a sabbatical, And Jim Alt had asked me to give some lectures at Harvard, and Doug North had
I
asked me
remember
to.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a wonderful thing that Doug had given a lecture on some early work that was at WashU, and he said, "Oh, you should do a book." And then Jim Alt asked me to give the lecture at Harvard. Five
And
of
this
them.
was for the series that they
Yeah.
were then co-editing,
Yes,
right?
yeah. And so I had a sabbatical and an invitation to do a book and 5 lectures at Harvard. And so I thought, what an opportunity.
Several years later.
Well, I had to give those lectures that spring. And about February, March, I thought, there's no way, I can't. And I just got desperate, and because I was identifying this kind of, was it all that they used 3/4 rules? Was it majority? Did they have to have a leader? And I couldn't find any of these statistically significant. So that's when I went up a level and said, well, can I get kind of some of the commonalities and that I then ended up calling design principles. But I chose cases that had been at least 100 years, if not more. So why were some successful, and then why were some failures?
Right.
And did those design principles count for anything? And I put them out because that was as good as I could do. And fortunately, they've been quite sustainable. There's now a study of 110 systems or so that are articles that have evaluated them, and a very large number of case studies, and they seem to be pretty robust. Not perfect, but robust.
So it sounds like the whole project that led to the publication of Governing the Commons was really in some ways transformative for your career as well.
Oh, yes.
I remember inviting you to do a Reader Meets Your Critics panel at APSA right after Governing the Commons. And
and the design principles were so far off.
yeah, I mean, people were just like, yeah.
Boundaries.
Right. No, it was a whole new language to learn, a whole new way to think about things. Absolutely.
And fortunately, I'd just been so immersed in it that it really made a difference. But I didn't come up with a decision rule. I said that people had to be able to make some of their own rules and then adapt them over time.
Right.
And that's what's so important.
The adaptation was also
really important. And people keep wanting the formula. And if I want one lesson, is there's no ideal formula for all of these things. Think how different they are.
Well, and you also imply that it depends what the problem is, at what level of government.
Yeah, and some things need national. Some things need global.
Right.
Some things need
very local.
Yeah, and some things don't need to be government at all.
Right, or governed. So where did that lead you then? So you did Governing the Commons, and you still weren't doing experimental work at that point, right? You were doing field work, you were doing metadata, and then you started getting really seriously. I can see how the game theory informed all that. That was clearly part of the story.
Well, I've been reading about experimental, and I actually taught with Bobby Herzberg a graduate seminar on experimental research, which was all work that others had done. And then one of my graduate students at that point, Rick Wilson, there was a faculty member that was an experimentalist. Jimmy hadn't come in yet, and he did his dissertation using game theory. It was an experimental. Now trying to find a way of taking a computer lab and turning it into experimental lab was tricky, but Rick did a fabulous job. And then Jimmy came to campus, and I looked him up and said, have you ever thought, because he'd already done a lot on public goods, but nothing on CPRs. And then with Roy here as a game theorist, it really enabled us to put those techniques together.
Oh, that's fabulous.
Yeah. And again, I wasn't a game theory expert. While I know enough to write it occasionally, I can collaborate. I wasn't an expert in experimental, but I was really interested. And then to be able to work with 2 experts and then to bring things from the field back to the lab really made a difference.
Absolutely. But one of your skills, one of your many skills, and this one was not so much learned at Bielefeld or required by a job like shorthand, is to find the people who do have the skills you need or the capacities you want and bring them together with each other as well as with you.
Well, but happenstance is part of that. And so I didn't
But not
recruit.
everybody can make happenstance.
But I didn't recruit either Jimmy or Roy.
No, I understand that.
They were here, and then I heard about them, and we began working together.
But, you know, when we were doing the review this week of the workshop, one of the things that became quite apparent is a number of people are there because you married them, as it were, sometimes quite literally, but intellectually more importantly, where they had sort of been vaguely aware of each other but didn't realize that they had some common interests that would make that there was a really mutual and big positive gain from working together.
Well, one of this is we have had a tradition of working groups.
Right.
And they're informal. Vincent and I did not say we must have one. People would want to get started on something. Okay, do you have an initial list? Will somebody take don't put it all on our secretarial staff.
Right.
Get it organized and thought through. And then I've been in some and noticed that, well, we needed a few more skills here, so can we get somebody else in? So I've invited people in. And then sometimes said, gee, can we work together?
Yeah, well, that's great. Okay, so we've gotten up to where you're dealing with game theory now and beginning to get involved with experiments. Now, and that led to the trust and reciprocity work and a variety of other things that begin to explore the common goods and common pool resource problems at a whole different level in a whole different set of settings. What led you to the remote sensing? And what got you in? The environmental questions that you study clearly come out of some of the common pool resource questions.
Well, one of the things that NSF did was indicate they wanted centers that would be looking across the ecological social science. And we set up one here on the called SciPec, the study of institutions, population, and environmental change. And Emilio Moran, who is a superb anthropologist, suggested we go in on a proposal, and we did, and we became a center. So for a while I co-directed the workshop and co-directed SciPec. And one of the tools he had learned, he is an anthropologist who had done a great deal of field work. Pardon me. And they were making claims about things from remote sensing that he thought were wrong.
Ah, okay.
So he had trained himself in remote sensing. And then we ran a summer program where we trained them in remote, in a little bit of game theory, not too much, but enough, in institutional analysis and in fieldwork.
So is this the first time with the SciPec that fieldwork has been brought together with remote sensing?
No, Emilio had certainly brought it together before.
Okay, so Emilio is crucial in that.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And see, he was studying the Amazon and some of the patterns of deforestation, and by going up, he could observe patterns that you can't on the ground. And that's why they're so important, because you can interpret it better if you've been on the ground when you're looking above. But he has some fantastic early articles that are just unbelievable, and I learned so much.
So I only have a few more questions because we are beginning to run out of time. I can't help but ask how the Nobel Prize is affecting and likely to affect your work and your life.
Yeah.
I know it's you just won it on Monday, so.
I'm still
one thing I didn't find credible about your winning the Nobel Prize was the announcement that you were woken at 6:30. My experience of you is that you're sending emails at 4 a.m. in the morning.
Sometimes. I had been up early and gone back to bed.
Oh, there you go. Okay, so you were taking a nap when they woke you up.
But I sometimes now, I'm in my 70s, so sometimes I do actually sleep to 7.
Oh, good for you, Elinor. I'm glad.
But I had been up, yes. But they woke me up because I had gone back and I was really sound asleep.
So how do you think it's going to change the way you do work and what your life is going to be like?
Well, it's not going to change the way I do work because that's teamwork and
you want to be part of the team.
Yeah. But I haven't quite absorbed. The email load has just been unbelievable, and it's fun talking with you, but this is about, I've been averaging 6 or so interviews every day.
Right.
And
Well, this was planned. A
yes,
while ago.
it was planned a long time ago, and what a pleasure for me.
Yeah.
But hopefully there'll be a little bit of quiet in here somewhere where I can actually think about this.
Yeah, I
But
imagine.
we've got new research projects that were already coming along, and we're going with them.
Good. That's great. Is there anything else you want to tell me or you think our readers should know about?
Well, I think they should read your work.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I think that I've learned a great deal, and I think part of our overlap of interest is that just having formal rules are not enough. And then the question is, where do the rules come from? What are the incentives of the people inside? What are they to just, go by them and not let anybody know and just cheat? What are the incentives to change them?
Right.
All of those things. And we've been kind of taught as political scientists that those rules are the rules. And what we know from the field is that rules on paper and rules in form are different.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So that's maybe the lesson.
Thank you, Lynn. This has been a real pleasure to talk to you as always.
Thank you.